You believe that detaching means stopping caring or abandoning those you love. But Buddhist monks have taught exactly the opposite for over 2,500 years. When you learn to love without possessing, to care without clinging, your emotional pain begins to dissolve naturally. This kind of loving detachment doesn't push people away. In fact, it connects you more deeply with them and with yourself. The secret lies in understanding that you can love intensely without turning that love into a prison. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment from which part of the world you're watching, because now I'm going to tell you everything. Have you ever felt that the more desperately you try to hold on to something, the more it seems to slip through your fingers? This experience is at the heart of what Buddhism identifies as one of our most common human struggles. Non-attachment, known as nekkhamma in Pali, offers a different approach to our relationships with people, possessions, and even our own thoughts and emotions. When most people first hear about non-attachment, they often misunderstand it as being cold, distant, or not caring about anything. Nothing could be further from the truth in Buddhist practice. Non-attachment doesn't mean we stop loving or caring. Instead, it means we learn to love in a way that doesn't cause suffering through possessiveness, control, or unhealthy dependence. The Buddha taught that attachment or clinging upadana is actually one of the primary causes of suffering dukkha in our lives. When we become attached to specific outcomes, people, or possessions, we set ourselves up for disappointment and pain because we're resisting the natural flow of change that defines our existence. Think about it. How often have you suffered not because of what happened, but because what happened wasn't what you wanted or expected? In Buddhist psychology, attachment operates in subtle ways that we might not immediately recognize. We become attached to our identities, our roles in relationships, our expectations of how others should behave, and even our ideas about what love should look like. Each of these attachments creates conditions for our happiness, essentially saying, "I can only be happy if things are exactly this way." This conditional approach to happiness guarantees disappointment in a world that constantly changes. Non-attachment invites us to hold our relationships and experiences lightly, fully appreciating them while they're present, but not grasping at them when circumstances change. It's like the difference between clenching your fist around sand, watching it squeeze out between your fingers, versus holding sand with an open palm where it can rest freely. Consider how attachment shows up in our relationships. When we love someone with attachment, we often develop expectations about how they should behave, what they should think, and how they should express love to us. We might become anxious when they don't respond to messages immediately, feel threatened when they develop new friendships, or try to control their behavior to ease our own insecurities. This attached form of love is conditional. We love the person as long as they fit within the parameters we've created. Non-attached love, by contrast, appreciates the other person as they truly are, not as we need them to be. It respects their autonomy and right to make their own choices. This doesn't mean we become doormats or accept harmful behavior, quite the opposite. Non-attachment gives us the clarity to set healthy boundaries precisely because we're not clouded by the need to control or possess the other person. The Buddha offered a beautiful metaphor for this way of loving. He compared non-attached love to the way a lotus flower grows in water. The lotus needs the water to survive and flourish, yet it never becomes submerged or defined by the water. It maintains its own integrity while being in relationship with its environment. Similarly, healthy love allows us to be in deep relationship while maintaining our own separate wholeness. One common misconception about non-attachment is that it leads to passivity or not caring about outcomes. In reality, non-attachment actually enables more effective action because we're responding to situations as they actually are, not as we wish them to be. We can work toward goals, nurture relationships, and engage passionately with life while simultaneously accepting that we cannot control all outcomes. For example, a parent practicing non-attachment still loves their child deeply and provides guidance and support. However, they recognize that ultimately their child is a separate being who must make their own choices and learn from their own experiences. The parent doesn't withdraw love when the child makes different choices than the parent would prefer. This non-attached parenting creates space for authentic growth rather than compliance based on fear of losing love. Non-attachment also applies to our relationship with our thoughts and emotions. When we practice meditation, we learn to observe thoughts arising without immediately identifying with them or being carried away by them. We create space between stimulus and response, between feeling an emotion and acting on it. This inner freedom gives us choices rather than leaving us at the mercy of habitual reactions. The path to developing non-attachment begins with awareness. We must first recognize where we're clinging and how that clinging creates suffering. This isn't always comfortable. We often defend our attachments fiercely, mistaking them for love or commitment. But with gentle persistence, we can start to notice the telltale signs of attachment. Anxiety when things don't go as planned, controlling behaviors in relationships, difficulty accepting change, or feeling that our happiness depends entirely on external circumstances. Meditation practices help cultivate this awareness. Through mindfulness meditation, we develop the capacity to observe our thoughts and feelings without immediately reacting to them. We begin to see the patterns of attachment as they arise in real time, creating the possibility of new responses. Loving kindness meditation, metta, helps us develop a form of love that wishes well for others without conditions or expectations. Another powerful practice is contemplating impermanence, anicca, by regularly reflecting on the changing nature of all things, our bodies, relationships, possessions, feelings. We gradually loosen our grip on the illusion of permanence that fuels much of our attachment. This isn't about becoming pessimistic, but rather about aligning our expectations with reality, which ultimately brings greater peace. The practice of generosity, dana, also helps cultivate non-attachment. By willingly sharing what we have, whether material possessions, time, or emotional support, we practice letting go and discover that our well-being doesn't depend on accumulation or holding on. Each act of giving weakens the habit of clinging and strengthens our capacity for open-handedness with life. As we progress on this path, we discover something paradoxical. Non-attachment actually enables deeper connection and more authentic love. When we're not burdened by the need to control, possess, or extract validation from our relationships, we can be truly present with others. We can listen deeply rather than formulating our response. We can offer support without needing recognition. We can love without the fear of loss that makes us grasp and cling. This freedom creates relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than need or habit. Non-attachment allows us to continue loving someone even when the form of the relationship changes. We can maintain goodwill toward former partners, adapt to children growing up and away, or accept the natural ebbs and flows of friendships without interpreting changes as rejection or failure. In the workplace, non-attachment helps us contribute our best effort while letting go of excessive concern about recognition or results. We can propose ideas without becoming defensive if they're not accepted. We can mentor others without needing to control their development. We can navigate changes and setbacks with greater resilience because our sense of worth isn't tied to external validation or specific outcomes. The beauty of non-attachment is that it's not an all-or-nothing achievement, but a continuous practice. No one reaches a state of perfect non-attachment. Rather, we gradually loosen the grip of clinging in various aspects of our lives. We might practice non-attachment easily in some areas while finding others more challenging. This is normal and part of the human journey. As we cultivate non-attachment, we discover that it leads not to disconnection, but to a more expansive sense of connection. When we're not narrowly focused on our personal attachments and preferences, we become more aware of our interconnection with all of life. Our circle of care widens. We begin to see that our well-being is inextricably linked with the well-being of others and of our planet. This more expansive perspective is the true freedom that non-attachment offers. Freedom from the small prison of our attachments and freedom for a more generous, flexible engagement with the world as it actually is. In this freedom, we find not coldness or indifference, but a warm-hearted presence that can respond skillfully to life's constant changes while maintaining an inner core of peace. This expansive perspective on non-attachment brings us to an important distinction that's often misunderstood. Many people hear detachment and immediately picture someone who's emotionally cold, distant, or simply doesn't care. They worry that practicing detachment might turn them into indifferent observers of life rather than engaged participants. This confusion between detachment and indifference is so common that it prevents many from exploring this valuable approach to healing. So what exactly is the difference between detaching with love and being indifferent? The distinction is subtle but profound. Detachment, as understood in Buddhist practice, maintains warmth, care, and compassion while releasing unhealthy control and expectations. Indifference, on the other hand, involves emotional disconnection and a lack of concern for others' well-being. One comes from an open heart, the other from a closed one. When we detach with love, we still deeply care about the other person. We want what's best for them. We remain emotionally present and available. The difference is that we're no longer entangled in trying to control their choices or make their happiness our responsibility. We recognize and respect their journey as separate from our own, even while maintaining connection. Indifference, by contrast, involves emotional withdrawal. When we're indifferent, we've closed ourselves off from caring about the other person's experience. We might do this as a defense mechanism when we've been hurt, but it's quite different from the balanced detachment that Buddhism teaches. Indifference says, "I don't care what happens to you," while detachment with love says, "I care deeply about you, but I understand I cannot control your path." You can often recognize the difference in how it feels in your body. Indifference typically has a quality of hardness or numbness. There's a sense of cutting off, of building walls. Detachment with love feels spacious and open. There's room for both compassion and boundaries. Your heart remains soft, even as you create necessary distance. Buddhist teachings emphasize that true detachment is warm and engaged. The Buddha didn't teach withdrawal from life or relationships, but rather a way of relating that doesn't cause suffering through clinging. This balanced approach is sometimes called the middle way, neither grasping at others nor pushing them away. It's a path between extremes that honors both connection and independence. Consider someone dealing with a loved one's addiction. Indifference would mean washing your hands of the person entirely. Not my problem anymore. Detachment with love would involve maintaining care and concern while recognizing you cannot control their choices. You might still offer support for recovery efforts, but you step back from enabling behaviors or making their sobriety your responsibility. You recognize that sometimes allowing natural consequences is the most loving action, even when it's painful to witness. This compassionate detachment allows us to remain emotionally present without becoming enmeshed in destructive patterns. It creates space for both parties to take responsibility for their own emotions and choices. When we detach with love, we can offer support without becoming overwhelmed by other suffering or trying to fix everything. The Buddha taught about this balanced approach through the concept of equanimity, upekkha, one of the four sublime states or brahmaviharas. Equanimity involves a steady, unwavering mind that can stay present with whatever arises without being swept away by it. It's neither cold indifference nor passionate attachment, but a middle ground that allows for wise, compassionate action. Practicing detachment with love requires developing awareness of our tendency to swing between these extremes. Many of us have patterns of either excessive involvement, where we become entangled in others' problems and lose our boundaries, or emotional withdrawal when things get difficult. The Buddhist path invites us to notice these tendencies and gradually cultivate a more balanced approach. This balance honors both our own boundaries and the autonomy of others to follow their own path. When we detach with love, we recognize that true compassion sometimes means stepping back rather than jumping in to rescue. We understand that allowing others to face the natural consequences of their actions can be an act of respect for their journey and growth process. For example, parents practicing detachment with love might support their adult children emotionally while refusing to bail them out financially when they repeatedly make poor decisions. The parents still care deeply, but they recognize that continuing to rescue might actually prevent necessary growth. This isn't abandonment. It's a recognition that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is allow others to learn from experience. Cultivating this compassionate distance takes practice and self-awareness. One helpful approach is to check your motivation when creating distance in a relationship. Are you stepping back out of anger, hurt, or a desire to punish the other person? Or are you creating space out of genuine care for both your well-being and theirs? The first motivation leads to indifference, while the second fosters detachment with love. Another helpful practice is to notice the quality of your thoughts toward the person. Indifference is often accompanied by dismissive or judgmental thoughts that write the person off entirely. Detachment with love maintains a fundamental respect and goodwill toward the person, even while acknowledging challenges in the relationship. You can disagree with someone's choices while still wishing them well. The skilled practice of loving detachment creates a middle way between codependent involvement and cold withdrawal. It allows us to be emotionally honest about our limits while still honoring our connections. This balance is particularly important in relationships with significant challenges, such as those affected by addiction, mental health issues, or patterns of conflict. Buddhist teachings offer several practices that help cultivate this balanced approach. Loving-kindness meditation, metta, develops our capacity for universal, non-possessive care. This practice systematically extends goodwill to ourselves, loved ones, neutral people, difficult people, and eventually all beings. By regularly practicing loving-kindness, we strengthen our ability to maintain goodwill even when we need to establish boundaries or step back from unhealthy dynamics. Mindfulness meditation helps us observe our own reactions without immediately acting on them. When we're mindful, we can notice when we're becoming enmeshed in someone else's problems or when we're starting to shut down emotionally. This awareness creates space for choice rather than automatic reaction. We can choose a middle path rather than swinging between extremes. Compassion practices help us maintain a warm heart even in difficult situations. Buddhist compassion isn't about fixing others' problems, but rather the sincere wish that suffering be relieved, coupled with the wisdom to know what we can and cannot control. When we approach detachment from this compassionate perspective, we avoid the coldness of indifference. In daily life, practicing detachment with love might look like listening attentively to someone's problems without immediately jumping in with solutions. It might mean clearly communicating your boundaries while still expressing care for the other person. It could involve supporting someone's recovery efforts while refusing to shield them from the natural consequences of their actions. In each case, you maintain connection while respecting separation. This approach is particularly valuable in relationships where there's a history of codependency or enmeshment. Many of us grew up in family systems where boundaries were unclear, and we learned to take responsibility for others' emotions or behavior. Detaching with love helps us unlearn these patterns and develop healthier ways of relating, where we can care deeply without becoming entangled. It's important to remember that detaching with love is a process, not a one-time decision. Our tendencies toward either grasping or aversion run deep and have often been reinforced over many years. Be patient with yourself as you practice finding this middle way. You might notice yourself swinging between over-involvement and withdrawal before finding balance. This is normal and part of the learning process. The paradox of detaching with love is that it often improves relationships rather than diminishing them. When we relate to others without clinging or controlling, we create space for authentic connection. Others can feel the difference between being truly seen and respected versus being managed or controlled. Even if the form of the relationship changes, the quality of connection often deepens. This approach also honors the reality that we cannot truly control others. Much suffering comes from trying to manage others' choices, feelings, or behavior. an effort that ultimately fails because each person has their own agency. Detaching with love acknowledges this truth and works with it rather than against it. We focus on what we can control, our own responses, boundaries, and actions, while releasing what we cannot. The Buddhist perspective on detachment with love reminds us that this practice isn't about becoming distant or uncaring, but rather about finding a way to care that doesn't create suffering. It's about relating to others from a place of freedom rather than need or fear. This balanced approach allows us to maintain connection while respecting the separate journeys that each of us must travel. As we develop this skill, we discover that detaching with love creates freedom not only for ourselves but also for those around us. When we release our grip on trying to control others, we give them space to grow and change according to their own inner guidance. This mutual freedom forms the foundation for relationships based on choice and authentic care rather than obligation or dependency. This mutual freedom and authentic care form the bedrock of healthy relationships. But how exactly do we cultivate this balanced approach to loving? One powerful method that Buddhist tradition offers is loving-kindness meditation, known in Pali as metta. This practice specifically develops our capacity to love without grasping, providing a practical foundation for the healthy detachment we've been discussing. Metta meditation is a systematic practice that trains the heart and mind to generate feelings of goodwill, kindness, and care, first toward ourselves and then gradually extending outward to others. Unlike many forms of meditation that focus primarily on awareness or concentration, metta directly cultivates positive emotional states. It's essentially a method for developing a particular quality of heart that allows us to care deeply without becoming attached. The practice typically begins with directing loving kindness toward yourself. This starting point is crucial because many of us struggle with self-criticism and judgment. Without a foundation of self-kindness, our attempts to detach from others often become harsh or punitive rather than loving. By beginning with ourselves, we establish the emotional tone that will characterize our detachment: warm, caring, and compassionate rather than cold or indifferent. In a typical metta practice, you might begin by sitting comfortably and bringing to mind a sense of goodwill toward yourself. Some teachers suggest recalling a time when you felt happy or imagining being held in the care of someone who deeply loves you. From this feeling, you might silently repeat phrases such as, "May I be happy," "May I be healthy," "May I be safe," "May I live with ease." The exact phrases aren't as important as the sincere intention behind them. After establishing loving kindness toward yourself, the practice gradually expands to include others. Traditionally, this expansion follows a specific sequence. After yourself, you direct loving kindness toward a benefactor, someone who has helped you, then a good friend, then a neutral person, someone you neither particularly like nor dislike, then a difficult person, and finally to all beings everywhere. This systematic approach helps dissolve the boundaries we typically create between those we care about and those we don't. This expansive quality is exactly what makes metta such a powerful foundation for healthy detachment. It trains us to develop a form of love that isn't limited to those we're attached to or those who meet our needs. Instead, it cultivates a universal, non-possessive love that can extend to all beings regardless of our relationship with them. This universality helps us transcend the usual patterns of clinging, control, and condition that characterize attached forms of love. In Buddhist psychology, metta is considered one of 4 Brahma Viharas, or divine abodes, qualities of heart that create both inner peace and harmonious relationships. The other 3 are compassion, karuna, appreciative joy, mudita, and equanimity, upekkha. These 4 qualities work together to develop a balanced approach to relationships. Compassion complements loving kindness by responding to suffering with the wish to alleviate it. While metta wishes for happiness, compassion recognizes pain and responds with care rather than aversion. This quality helps us stay present with difficult emotions, both our own and others, without becoming overwhelmed by them. It allows us to acknowledge suffering without immediately trying to fix or control it, an essential aspect of healthy detachment. Appreciative joy is the quality of taking delight in others' happiness and good fortune. This might seem simple, but it directly counters our tendencies toward jealousy, comparison, and possessiveness. When we can genuinely rejoice in others' happiness regardless of how it affects us, we're practicing a form of love that doesn't need to possess or control. This quality helps us release the grip of wanting others to be a certain way for our benefit. Equanimity, the fourth Brahma Vihara, is particularly relevant to our discussion of detachment. It's the quality of mental balance that allows us to remain steady and open-hearted in all situations, whether pleasant or unpleasant, whether people are acting as we wish or not. Equanimity helps us maintain a caring presence without being swept away by emotional reactivity. It's the quality that allows us to love consistently without our care being dependent on conditions. Together, these four qualities, loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity, create a framework for relating to others that naturally embodies healthy detachment. They train us to care deeply while holding lightly, to remain engaged without becoming entangled. Regular practice helps these qualities become our default way of relating, rather than something we struggle to remember in difficult moments. The practical effects of regular metta practice can be profound. Research has shown that even brief periods of loving-kindness meditation can increase positive emotions, reduce negative emotions, and strengthen feelings of connection with others. Over time, consistent practice actually changes our baseline emotional state and our default ways of relating to ourselves and others. One of the most valuable aspects of metta practice for healthy detachment is that it helps us maintain goodwill toward others even when we need to establish boundaries or step back from unhealthy dynamics. Often when we try to create distance in relationships, we do so from a place of anger, hurt, or resentment. This approach typically leads to conflict or further entanglement rather than healthy separation. Metta provides an alternative. We can create necessary distance while maintaining a foundation of goodwill and care. For example, someone practicing metta might need to limit contact with a family member who consistently violates boundaries. Without loving kindness as a foundation, this limitation might be implemented with hostility or bitter resentment. With metta practice, the same boundary can be set while maintaining genuine good wishes for the other person's well-being. This doesn't mean tolerating harmful behavior, but rather approaching the necessary separation with a different quality of heart. As loving kindness becomes more established in our hearts through regular practice, detachment naturally arises as we no longer need others to be certain ways for our happiness. We discover that our capacity for joy, peace, and love exists independently of others' behavior or the specific circumstances of our relationships. This inner resource gives us the freedom to relate to others without the desperation that comes from emotional dependency. This emotional resilience is crucial for navigating the inevitable changes in relationships. When we practice metta regularly, we develop the capacity to maintain care and goodwill even when relationships become challenging or when they need to change form. This steadiness allows us to make clear-headed decisions about our relationships based on wisdom and compassion rather than fear or attachment. It's important to understand that metta practice isn't about generating a superficial niceness or denying genuine feelings. It's not about forcing yourself to feel loving towards someone who has hurt you deeply. Rather, it's a gradual process of transformation that works at a deeper level than our immediate emotional reactions. Even while acknowledging hurt, anger, or fear, we can hold an intention of goodwill that exists alongside these difficult emotions. The Buddha offered specific instructions for working with difficult emotions in metta practice. If you find it impossible to feel loving kindness towards someone who has hurt you, he suggested first developing metta toward yourself and those you easily feel goodwill toward. Only after establishing this foundation would you gradually work toward including more challenging people. He also suggested using compassion rather than loving kindness when relating to those who have caused harm, acknowledging the suffering that must be present for someone to act harmfully. Practicing metta doesn't mean we bypass the necessary work of processing hurt or setting appropriate boundaries. Instead, it creates a container of goodwill within which this healing work can happen more effectively. When our hearts aren't hardened by hatred or resentment, we can see more clearly and respond more wisely to challenging relationship dynamics. In daily life, metta practice might take the form of a formal meditation period where you systematically extend loving kindness to yourself and others. This could be as brief as 5 minutes or as long as an hour, depending on your schedule and experience. Many practitioners find that even short, regular sessions have a cumulative effect that gradually transforms their way of relating to others. Metta can also be practiced informally throughout the day. You might silently offer good wishes to people you pass on the street, to colleagues in difficult meetings, or to yourself when facing challenges. Some practitioners use transitions in their day, like stopping at a red light or waiting in line, as reminders to offer metta to themselves or others. These brief moments of practice help integrate loving kindness into daily life rather than keeping it confined to formal meditation. Another approach is to use metta phrases or intentions when interacting with specific people, especially in challenging relationships. Before a difficult conversation, you might take a moment to silently wish the other person well, setting an intention to speak from goodwill rather than hostility, regardless of how the interaction unfolds. This doesn't guarantee a perfect conversation, but it does shift the quality of your participation. The effects of consistent metta practice tend to unfold gradually over time. You might notice subtle shifts in how you respond to frustration or conflict, finding more patience or a greater capacity to see others' perspectives. You might discover that your need to control others diminishes as your own sense of inner well-being grows stronger. The grip of attachment may loosen not through force of will, but through the natural opening of the heart that metta cultivates. As these changes unfold, you'll likely find that detachment becomes less of a struggle and more of a natural expression of a heart that has learned to love without conditions. Rather than feeling like you're constantly fighting against your tendency to become attached or entangled, you begin to experience moments where a more spacious, generous love flows naturally. This doesn't mean you'll never experience attachment again. These are deeply ingrained patterns, but the direction of transformation becomes clear. One of the most beautiful aspects of metta practice is that it benefits both ourselves and others simultaneously. As we develop greater loving kindness, we suffer less from the pain of attachment, jealousy, and possessiveness. We experience more joy, greater peace, and more authentic connections. At the same time, those around us benefit from interacting with someone who wishes them well unconditionally, who doesn't try to control or manipulate them, and who can maintain goodwill even during conflict. This win-win quality makes metta a sustainable practice that we can return to throughout our lives. Unlike approaches to detachment that require constantly fighting against our desires or suppressing our emotions, metta works by nurturing positive qualities that naturally lead to a healthier relationship with ourselves and others. It's a practice of cultivation rather than suppression, of growth rather than restriction. With consistent practice, loving kindness gradually becomes the water we swim in, the background tone of our relationship with life. From this foundation, healthy detachment emerges not as something we have to constantly struggle to maintain, but as the natural expression of a heart that has learned how to love freely, without the constraints of clinging or conditions. This natural expression of a heart that has learned to love freely brings us to another core Buddhist teaching that powerfully supports healthy detachment: understanding impermanence. Known in Pali as anicca, impermanence is one of the 3 marks of existence in Buddhist philosophy. While loving kindness meditation directly cultivates the emotional quality of our relationships, working with impermanence addresses our fundamental misconception about the nature of reality that leads to unhealthy attachment in the first place. Impermanence refers to the fact that everything is in constant flux. Nothing stays the same forever. Our bodies, thoughts, emotions, relationships, possessions, circumstances, all are continuously changing. This might seem obvious when stated directly, but we often live as if the opposite were true. We plan as though things will remain stable. We cling to relationships as if they could be frozen in time, and we're repeatedly shocked and distressed when change inevitably occurs. The Buddha identified our resistance to impermanence as a primary cause of suffering. We want pleasant experiences to last forever and unpleasant ones to end immediately. We want people we love to remain exactly as they are, and we want our relationships to maintain the same form indefinitely. When reality doesn't conform to these expectations, which it never fully can, we experience disappointment, grief, anxiety, or anger. Understanding and accepting impermanence doesn't mean becoming pessimistic or fatalistic. It's not about dwelling on loss or adopting a why bother attitude toward relationships since they'll eventually change. Rather, recognizing impermanence helps us align our expectations with reality, allowing us to engage more fully with life as it actually is rather than as we wish it would be. When we deeply accept the transient nature of all phenomena, we can love fully in the present without desperately trying to freeze moments or relationships in time. We can appreciate the beauty of what we have right now, knowing that this particular configuration of circumstances is unique and will never be repeated in exactly the same way. This awareness doesn't diminish joy. It actually intensifies it by removing the veil of taking things for granted. Consider how our resistance to impermanence shows up in relationships. We often become attached to particular phases or dynamics, wanting them to continue indefinitely. Parents might wish their children would stay young and dependent. Partners might want the intensity of early romance to last forever. Friends might expect relationships to maintain the same closeness despite changing life circumstances. When the inevitable changes occur, children grow up, romantic relationships evolve, friendships shift in response to life transitions. We often experience this as loss or failure, rather than as the natural flow of life. Working with impermanence helps us recognize that change in relationships isn't necessarily a problem to be solved, but rather a reality to be accepted. Children are supposed to grow up and become independent. Romantic relationships naturally evolve beyond the initial infatuation phase. Friendships expand and contract in response to life circumstances. When we understand this, we can focus on relating skillfully to what's actually happening rather than struggling against the current of change. This doesn't mean we passively accept harmful changes or never work to improve difficult situations. Understanding impermanence actually helps us distinguish between natural, inevitable changes and those that result from unskillful actions or patterns. We can work to address the latter while accepting the former, bringing wisdom to our choices about where to direct our energy. The Buddha offered several contemplative practices to help us integrate the understanding of impermanence. One approach is to simply notice the changing nature of experience during meditation. As you sit quietly, you might observe how sensations arise and pass away in the body, how thoughts appear and dissolve in the mind, how sounds come and go. This direct observation helps us recognize at an experiential level that nothing stays the same even from moment to moment. Another practice involves deliberately reflecting on the impermanent nature of things we typically take for granted. You might contemplate how your body has changed throughout your life and will continue to change. You might reflect on how your personality and preferences have evolved over time. You might consider how the people in your life have changed, how relationships have transformed, how circumstances have shifted. This reflection isn't meant to induce anxiety, but rather to align our understanding with reality. The Buddha particularly recommended contemplating the impermanence of pleasant experiences while they're occurring. When you're enjoying something, a beautiful sunset, a delicious meal, a moment of connection with a loved one, you might mentally note, "This too will pass." Far from ruining the experience, this awareness often deepens our appreciation by reminding us not to take the moment for granted. We savor it fully precisely because we know it won't last forever. This practice of embracing impermanence is especially valuable when we're facing the end of a relationship or a significant change in its form. Whether through breakup, divorce, death, or simply growing apart, all relationships eventually change form. Our cultural narratives often frame these transitions as failures, especially in romantic relationships where happily ever after is presented as the ideal outcome. The Buddhist understanding of impermanence offers a different perspective, one that acknowledges the pain of loss while recognizing it as part of the natural order rather than something that went wrong. Recognizing impermanence helps us grieve losses more completely. Instead of getting caught in narratives about how things should have lasted or remained the same, we can acknowledge the reality of change and allow ourselves to feel the genuine sadness that accompanies it. This acceptance actually supports the grieving process, allowing emotions to move through us rather than becoming stuck in resistance or denial. When we understand impermanence, we can also maintain a sense of gratitude for what was shared rather than focusing exclusively on what was lost. A relationship that has ended still provided connection, growth, and meaning during its time. A friendship that has changed form still enriched our lives in significant ways. This perspective doesn't deny the pain of loss, but places it within a larger context that includes appreciation for what was experienced. Practicing with impermanence means developing the capacity to welcome each moment of connection while being at peace with its inevitable passing. It means loving people as they are now while allowing space for them to change and grow. It means holding our relationships lightly, not in the sense of devaluing them, but in the sense of not grasping at them with a tight fist that ultimately squeezes the life out of what we're trying to hold. This approach to relationships creates a different kind of security, one based not on things staying the same, but on our capacity to respond skillfully to change. Rather than seeking safety and stability, which is ultimately an illusion, we develop confidence in our ability to adapt, to find meaning and connection within changing circumstances, to open and close our hearts as needed without becoming stuck in either attachment or aversion. The awareness of impermanence infuses our relationships with both preciousness and freedom. They become precious because we recognize their transience. We don't take for granted that the people we love will always be with us in the same way. They gain freedom because we're not trying to hold them in place. We allow space for growth, change, and natural evolution without interpreting these as threats to the relationship. In practical terms, embracing impermanence might look like appreciating your partner as they are today without clinging to how they were when you first met or having fixed expectations about how they should be in the future. It might mean enjoying the current phase of a friendship while recognizing that its form may change as life circumstances evolve. It might involve savoring time with aging parents or growing children while accepting that these particular dynamics are temporary. When difficult emotions or relationship challenges arise, the understanding of impermanence offers perspective. We recognize that these feelings and circumstances, however intense they may be in the moment, will not last forever. This doesn't invalidate the experience, but it does help us avoid catastrophizing or becoming defined by temporary states. We can think this too shall pass without using it as a way to bypass necessary emotional processing. Working with impermanence also helps us recognize that our identities within relationships are constantly evolving. We're not fixed entities relating to other fixed entities, but rather flowing processes interacting with other flowing processes. The you of 10 years ago was different from the you of today, and the you of 10 years from now will be different still. The same is true for everyone in your life. This understanding can help us release attachment to particular roles or dynamics that may no longer serve the evolving relationship. It's important to distinguish between understanding impermanence intellectually and integrating it at a deeper level. Many of us can acknowledge that everything changes when asked directly. but we still live much of our lives operating from the unconscious assumption of permanence. Moving from intellectual understanding to embodied wisdom requires consistent practice and gentle persistence. It involves repeatedly bringing awareness to our expectations of stability and our reactions when change occurs. The Buddha recommended regular reflection on 5 subjects, known as the 5 remembrances, to help integrate the understanding of impermanence. These include contemplating the inevitability of aging, illness, death, separation from loved ones, and the fact that our actions have consequences that follow us. While these may sound depressing at first glance, practitioners often report that regularly contemplating these truths actually increases appreciation for life and reduces anxiety by aligning expectations with reality. As we deepen our understanding of impermanence, we discover that it doesn't diminish our capacity for commitment or undermine the value of long-term relationships. Instead, it transforms how we approach commitment. From trying to hold something static to committing to being present with the relationship as it naturally evolves. We can still make promises and maintain connections over time, but we do so with the awareness that the form these take will inevitably change. This perspective can be especially helpful during major life transitions that affect relationships, career changes, relocations, the birth of children, retirement, health challenges. Rather than seeing these changes as threats to our connections, we can approach them as natural evolutions that invite us to discover new ways of relating. The relationships that weather these transitions most successfully are often those where both parties understand and accept impermanence rather than fighting against it. The Buddhist understanding of impermanence ultimately offers both realism and hope. It's realistic about the changing nature of all things, including our most cherished relationships. It acknowledges that loss and separation are inevitable parts of life. At the same time, it offers hope by showing us that attachment and clinging aren't the only ways to love. We can develop a way of relating that fully embraces each moment of connection while releasing the impossible demand that things stay the same. This approach doesn't eliminate pain, but it does reduce the suffering that comes from fighting against reality, allowing us to heal more completely when losses occur and to love more freely in each precious passing moment. This approach of embracing the present while accepting change provides a foundation for another crucial aspect of detaching with love: establishing compassionate boundaries. While understanding impermanence helps us accept reality as it is, boundaries help us engage with that reality in ways that protect our well-being without closing our hearts. In Buddhist practice, boundaries aren't walls of rejection, but rather conscious choices about engagement that come from a place of wisdom and care. Buddhist compassion provides a framework for establishing boundaries that come from care rather than fear or anger. When most people think of setting boundaries, they often picture putting up defenses or pushing others away. But compassionate boundaries have a different quality. They're established not to punish or reject others, but to create the conditions for genuine well-being for everyone involved. They acknowledge that sometimes the most loving action is to limit engagement rather than to continue patterns that cause harm. Setting boundaries with compassion means honoring our own well-being while maintaining goodwill toward others, even those we need to create distance from. This approach aligns with the Buddhist concept of ahimsa, or non-harming. We seek to avoid causing unnecessary suffering to ourselves or others through our actions. We recognize that allowing harmful behaviors to continue unchecked ultimately causes suffering for everyone involved, not just ourselves. Consider the difference between two approaches to boundary setting. In the first, someone might say, "I'm cutting you out of my life because you're toxic and I hate how you treat me." In the second, they might say, "I need to limit our contact right now because the current dynamic is harmful for both of us. I still care about your well-being, but I need to step back." The first comes from a place of rejection and anger, the second from a place of clarity and care. Both create distance, but the emotional quality and long-term impact are quite different. This distinction is especially important when dealing with people we care about deeply: family members struggling with addiction, partners with mental health challenges, friends going through difficult phases. In these situations, we often feel torn between self-protection and supporting the other person. The Buddhist approach to boundaries offers a middle path. We can establish necessary limits while maintaining an attitude of compassion. The practice involves recognizing when helping becomes harmful and learning to step back without closing our hearts. This discernment is crucial because many of us, especially those with caregiving tendencies, struggle to distinguish between genuine support and enabling behaviors that ultimately reinforce harmful patterns. Buddhist practice helps us develop the clarity to see when our involvement actually contributes to ongoing suffering rather than alleviating it. For example, someone with an addicted family member might repeatedly provide money that ends up funding the addiction, bail them out of legal troubles, or lie to cover up problems. These actions, while motivated by care, often prevent the person from experiencing the natural consequences that might motivate change. Compassionate boundaries in this situation might involve refusing to provide financial support while still offering emotional presence, expressing care while allowing natural consequences, or setting clear limits on what behaviors you'll tolerate in your presence. Compassionate boundaries acknowledge that sometimes the most loving action is allowing others to experience the consequences of their choices. This isn't about punishment or teaching them a lesson, but rather about recognizing that protecting people from the natural outcomes of their actions often prevents necessary growth and change. When we constantly shield others from consequences, we may actually be interfering with their path toward healing. This approach requires developing discernment, pana, to distinguish between enabling and supporting, between healthy involvement and unhealthy attachment. This discernment doesn't develop overnight. It's cultivated through mindful attention to our motivations and the actual outcomes of our actions. We learn to ask ourselves, am I acting from a place of genuine compassion or from fear, guilt, or attachment? Does my involvement actually help this situation or perpetuate harmful patterns? Buddhist teachings offer several practices to help develop this discernment. Mindfulness meditation helps us observe our thoughts and emotions without immediately acting on them, creating space to examine our motivations more clearly. Loving kindness meditation cultivates the genuine care that should underlie our boundaries. Ethical contemplation helps us consider the long-term consequences of our actions rather than just immediate relief of discomfort. When boundaries are established with loving intention, they become opportunities for growth rather than walls of rejection. Clear boundaries can actually strengthen relationships by preventing the resentment and burnout that often result from boundary violations. They create a container of safety that allows authentic connection to flourish, rather than being undermined by harmful dynamics. It's important to remember that compassionate boundaries look different in different contexts. With some people, a compassionate boundary might involve limiting contact to occasional texts rather than in-person meetings. With others, it might mean being willing to listen but not to offer solutions or advice. In some situations, it might require temporarily cutting off contact entirely to allow for healing. The specific form is less important than the intention behind it and the clarity with which it's communicated. The Buddha himself modeled compassionate boundaries in his own life. There are numerous stories in the Buddhist texts where he declined to engage with those who came to him with harmful intentions or who weren't ready to hear his teachings. He didn't reject these people with anger, but he also didn't allow them to waste his time or create harmful situations. He maintained an attitude of goodwill while making clear choices about his engagement. One particularly relevant teaching comes from the Buddha's advice to his attendant, Ananda, about dealing with difficult people. He suggested approaching challenging interactions with goodwill, compassion, equanimity, and if necessary, maintaining a mindful distance. This wasn't about rejecting difficult people, but about engaging wisely and protecting the conditions for one's own practice and well-being. Setting compassionate boundaries often brings up difficult emotions. particularly for those who've been conditioned to prioritize others' needs above their own. Many of us were raised with messages that setting boundaries is selfish or unkind, that we should always be available to those we love, or that we're responsible for others' emotions and well-being. Buddhist practice helps us examine these beliefs and replace them with a more balanced understanding of compassion that includes ourselves in the circle of care. Guilt is perhaps the most common obstacle to healthy boundaries. We feel bad about saying no, limiting contact, or allowing others to experience the natural consequences of their actions. Buddhist teachings on compassion help us see that true compassion isn't about shielding others from all discomfort, but about supporting conditions for genuine, long-term well-being. Sometimes the most compassionate action in the moment isn't the most comfortable one. Fear often arises as well. Fear of conflict, rejection, abandonment, or harming the relationship. Mindfulness practice helps us recognize these fears without being controlled by them. We can acknowledge the discomfort while still taking necessary action, understanding that temporary discomfort often precedes growth and healing. The Buddhist understanding of impermanence reminds us that these difficult feelings too will pass. Communicating boundaries compassionately requires both clarity and kindness. Vague or implied boundaries are easily misunderstood or ignored, while boundaries communicated with hostility often create unnecessary conflict. The Buddhist practice of right speech offers guidance here. We aim to speak truthfully, helpfully, at the appropriate time, and in a way the other person can hear. This doesn't guarantee the other person will respond positively, but it creates the best conditions for mutual understanding. For example, instead of saying, "You're so draining, I can't deal with your problems anymore," a compassionate boundary might sound like, "I care about you, but I notice I don't have the emotional capacity right now to be helpful when we talk about this issue. Can we connect in other ways or talk about different topics?" The content of the boundary is similar, but the delivery acknowledges the humanity of both people and maintains the connection even while limiting certain interactions. It's also important to recognize that boundaries aren't static. They may need adjustment as circumstances change. The Buddhist understanding of impermanence reminds us that relationships evolve, people grow and change, and situations transform. The boundary that was necessary last year might not be needed today, or vice versa. Compassionate boundaries involve ongoing discernment rather than rigid rules. When we're on the receiving end of others' boundaries, Buddhist practice helps us respond with grace rather than reactivity. Instead of taking boundaries personally or as rejection, we can recognize that others have the right to protect their well-being just as we do. We can use these moments as opportunities for self-reflection, considering whether there are patterns in our behavior that others find difficult. This doesn't mean we always agree with others' assessments, but we remain open to the feedback inherent in their boundaries. The process of establishing compassionate boundaries is often challenging, especially at first. Many of us swing between extremes, either having no boundaries at all or cutting people off entirely when problems arise. Finding the middle path takes practice, patience, and a willingness to learn from mistakes. Buddhist practice encourages us to approach this learning process with self-compassion, recognizing that developing healthy boundaries is a skill that improves with time. As we become more skilled at establishing compassionate boundaries, we often notice positive changes in our relationships. When we're no longer operating from resentment or burnout, we can be more genuinely present with others during the time we do spend with them. When we're clear about what behaviors we will and won't engage with, we create space for more authentic and respectful interactions. When we stop enabling harmful patterns, we sometimes witness the natural growth that occurs when people face the consequences of their choices. Perhaps most importantly, compassionate boundaries allow us to remain open-hearted even in difficult relationships. Without boundaries, we often end up alternating between resentful compliance and angry withdrawal. Neither allows for genuine connection. When we have clear, compassionate boundaries, we can maintain goodwill toward others even when we need to limit our engagement. We can wish them well without feeling responsible for managing their lives or emotions. we can love them while honoring our own needs and limits. This balanced approach to relationships, neither enmeshed nor disconnected, neither controlling nor abandoning, embodies the middle way that lies at the heart of Buddhist practice. It acknowledges both our interconnection with others and our need for healthy separation. It honors both compassion and wisdom. It allows us to engage with the full spectrum of human relationships without losing ourselves in the process. Through the practice of compassionate boundaries, we discover that we can indeed protect ourselves without rejecting others, creating the conditions for genuine healing and growth for everyone involved. While compassionate boundaries help us navigate our relationships with others, there's another crucial dimension to consider: how we relate to ourselves throughout this process. Creating healthy separation while maintaining an open heart isn't just about how we treat others, it's equally about how we treat ourselves. Buddhist teachings emphasize that genuine compassion must include ourselves, creating the emotional stability needed to detach lovingly. Self-compassion forms the essential foundation for healthy detachment. Without it, our attempts to create distance often become harsh or punitive, either toward others or toward ourselves. We might swing between self-sacrifice and bitter resentment, neither of which allows for the balanced detachment that Buddhism teaches. By developing genuine kindness toward ourselves, we create the inner security that makes loving detachment possible. In Buddhist psychology, self-compassion isn't considered selfish or indulgent, but rather a necessary aspect of genuine compassion. The Buddha taught that we cannot truly offer compassion to others if we exclude ourselves from that same care. He demonstrated this through his own example, taking care of his physical needs, setting boundaries with difficult people, and balancing his time between teaching others and maintaining his own practice. This balanced approach acknowledges that caring for ourselves is not separate from caring for others. They're interdependent aspects of the same compassionate awareness. Self-compassion involves acknowledging our own suffering without judgment when relationships become painful or when we need to let go. Many of us find it easier to extend compassion to others than to ourselves. We might readily understand a friend's struggle with a difficult relationship while harshly judging ourselves for the same challenge. We might compassionately support others in setting boundaries while feeling guilty or selfish when we need to do the same. This double standard creates unnecessary suffering and actually undermines our ability to detach with love. The practice of treating ourselves with the same kindness we would offer a dear friend creates the inner security needed to detach without hardening our hearts. When we're self-compassionate, we can acknowledge our pain, our needs, and our limits without harsh self-judgment. We recognize that experiencing difficulty in relationships doesn't make us weak or defective, it makes us human. This gentle acceptance of our own humanity provides emotional resilience during challenging times. Consider how self-compassion might apply when ending a relationship that's become unhealthy. Without self-compassion, we might ignore our own suffering until we reach a breaking point, then leave with anger and blame. Or we might stay far too long out of guilt, believing we don't deserve better or that our needs don't matter. With self-compassion, we can acknowledge our pain earlier, consider our needs with kindness, and make decisions from a place of clarity rather than reactivity. We can honor the relationship's importance while also honoring our need for well-being. As we develop self-compassion, we become less dependent on external validation and approval, making it easier to release unhealthy attachments. Many of us learned early in life to seek our sense of worth from others' responses to us. We came to believe that we're only as good as others think we are, only as valuable as our usefulness to them, only as lovable as their treatment of us suggests. This dependency makes healthy detachment nearly impossible because we feel we need others' approval to be okay. Self-compassion gradually untangles this dependency by helping us develop an internal source of validation. We learn to offer ourselves the understanding, encouragement, and kindness that we previously sought exclusively from others. This doesn't mean we no longer value connection or care about others' perspectives. Rather, we develop a more balanced approach where external feedback informs but doesn't define our sense of self. For example, someone practicing self-compassion might still feel disappointed when a friend cancels plans but can soothe that disappointment without spiraling into self-doubt or abandonment fears. They might still value their partner's appreciation but don't fall apart when criticism occurs. They can receive both positive and negative feedback from others without their self-worth dramatically rising or falling as a result. This stability creates the foundation for relationships based on choice rather than desperate need. This balanced self-care enables us to remain steady when others' emotions are volatile, maintaining our center while still being present. When we lack self-compassion, others' emotional states often become contagious. Their anxiety becomes our anxiety. Their anger becomes our anger. Their criticism becomes our self-criticism. This emotional entanglement makes it difficult to offer genuine support because we're too caught up in our own reactions to respond skillfully. With self-compassion, we develop emotional boundaries that allow us to care deeply without becoming overwhelmed. We can listen to a friend's problems without absorbing their distress as our own. We can witness a family member's anger without immediately becoming defensive or angry ourselves. We can hold space for others' emotions while maintaining our own emotional balance. This capacity is essential for detaching with love rather than disconnecting out of self-protection. Self-compassion also helps us navigate the guilt that often arises when we need to create distance in relationships. Many of us have internalized messages that we're responsible for others' happiness or that prioritizing our needs is selfish. These beliefs can make even necessary detachment feel wrong or harmful. Self-compassion helps us examine these beliefs with kindness rather than accepting them as truth. We can acknowledge the discomfort of guilt while still taking needed action, understanding that genuine compassion includes ourselves in the circle of care. The Buddha offered specific practices to cultivate self-compassion. One approach is to include yourself explicitly in loving-kindness meditation, directing phrases like, "May I be happy, may I be peaceful, may I be safe," toward yourself before extending these wishes to others. Another practice involves placing a hand on your heart during moments of difficulty, acknowledging your struggle with gentle touch and kind attention. These simple practices can begin to counteract the habit of harsh self-judgment that many of us have developed. Another powerful practice is to notice our self-talk and gradually shift it toward greater kindness. Many of us speak to ourselves in ways we would never speak to someone we care about. We might call ourselves stupid for making a mistake, weak for having needs, or selfish for setting boundaries. With mindful awareness, we can catch these harsh judgments and ask, would I speak this way to a dear friend? If not, we can experiment with offering ourselves the same understanding we'd offer others. Self-compassion reminds us that our worth is intrinsic, not dependent on relationships or outcomes, giving us freedom to love without grasping. When we believe our value depends on being needed, wanted, or approved of by others, we tend to cling desperately to relationships even when they become harmful. We might tolerate mistreatment, suppress our needs, or try to control others' responses to us, all in an effort to maintain the external validation we think we need. As self-compassion develops, we gradually recognize that our worthiness of love and respect doesn't depend on others' ability or willingness to provide them. We can value connection while knowing that our fundamental worth remains intact, regardless of any particular relationship status. This understanding allows us to engage with others from a place of choice rather than desperate need. We can love because we want to share love, not because we need validation to feel okay. This inner security also helps us respond more skillfully when relationships change or end. Without self-compassion, we might interpret a breakup, a friendship drift, or even healthy boundaries as evidence of our unworthiness or failure. We might cling to relationships that no longer serve us or lash out in hurt when separation occurs. Self-compassion helps us hold these transitions differently. We can acknowledge the pain of loss while not taking it as a referendum on our value as a person. It's important to understand that developing self-compassion doesn't happen overnight, especially for those who've spent years or decades being harsh with themselves. Like any skill, it develops gradually through consistent practice and patient persistence. Many people report that they feel uncomfortable or even resistant when first practicing self-compassion. It can feel unfamiliar, indulgent, or even threatening to long-held beliefs about motivation and self-improvement. If you experience this resistance, it's helpful to approach it with, yes, self-compassion. Notice the discomfort without judgment. Recognize that it's normal to feel uncertain about new ways of relating to yourself, and continue experimenting with small acts of self-kindness. Over time, what initially feels awkward or artificial gradually becomes more natural as neural pathways associated with self-compassion strengthen through repeated activation. Research supports the benefits of self-compassion for relationships. Studies have found that more self-compassionate individuals tend to have healthier relationship behaviors. They're more likely to compromise, to communicate constructively during conflict, and to forgive both themselves and others for mistakes. They report greater relationship satisfaction and demonstrate more balanced approaches to both autonomy and connection. Rather than diminishing care for others, self-compassion actually enhances our capacity for genuine, sustainable compassion. As self-compassion becomes integrated into our daily lives, we often notice its effects rippling outward. When we're not depleted from harsh self-criticism or desperate for external validation, we have more emotional resources available for authentic connection. When we're not defending against our own pain, we can be more present with others' experiences. When we're not constantly seeking approval, we can listen more deeply and respond more genuinely. Self-compassion doesn't turn us inward away from others, but rather creates the conditions for more meaningful engagement. This integration of self-compassion with compassion for others embodies the Buddhist understanding that these qualities aren't separate or opposed, but mutually supportive. The heart that can hold its own suffering with kindness is the same heart that can respond skillfully to others' suffering. The wisdom that recognizes our own needs and boundaries is the same wisdom that can respect others' autonomy. The courage that allows us to face our own pain is the same courage that enables us to stay present with others in their difficult moments. In the context of detaching with love, self-compassion provides both the motivation and the means. It helps us recognize when a relationship is causing harm to ourselves, to the other person, or to both, and respond with care rather than either clinging or rejecting. It gives us the emotional stability to create necessary distance without closing our hearts in protection. It allows us to wish others well even when we cannot continue certain forms of engagement. Through the ongoing practice of including ourselves in the circle of compassion, we discover that we can indeed love both others and ourselves with wisdom, clarity, and an open heart. This wisdom and clarity in our relationship with ourselves creates the foundation for another essential aspect of detaching with love: the ability to recognize our attachment patterns as they arise. While self-compassion gives us the emotional stability to face difficult truths, mindfulness provides the awareness tools to see those patterns clearly in the first place. Mindfulness meditation, known as sati in Pali, develops our capacity to observe attachment arising in real time, creating space between impulse and action. Mindfulness is often described as moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness. It involves paying attention to our present experience, including thoughts, emotions, physical sensations, and external stimuli, with an attitude of openness and curiosity rather than reactivity. While this might sound simple, it's a radical departure from our usual way of moving through life, where we're often lost in thoughts about the past or future, operating on autopilot, or immediately judging experiences as good or bad. The Buddha taught mindfulness as a direct path to liberation from suffering, including the suffering caused by clinging to people and outcomes. He offered specific meditation practices to develop this quality of awareness, recognizing that it doesn't typically arise spontaneously, but rather must be intentionally cultivated. Through consistent practice, we learn to notice the physical sensations, emotions, and thoughts that signal when we're becoming attached or controlling. When we begin practicing mindfulness, we often discover just how frequently attachment arises in our daily experience. We might notice physical tension in our chest when someone doesn't respond to our message right away, revealing our attachment to immediate connection. We might observe racing thoughts planning what to say to change someone's mind, showing our attachment to controlling their perspective. We might become aware of a sinking feeling in our stomach when plans change, highlighting our attachment to specific outcomes. These observations aren't meant to make us feel bad about having attachments. They're simply information that helps us understand our patterns more clearly. With mindfulness, we bring a quality of kind attention to these experiences rather than harsh judgment. We're not trying to immediately eliminate all attachment, but rather to see it clearly as it arises, which naturally begins to loosen its grip. One of the most valuable aspects of mindfulness practice is that it creates space between stimulus and response, between feeling an urge and acting on it. Without mindfulness, we tend to move automatically from feeling to action. We feel hurt, so we lash out. We feel anxious, so we send multiple messages checking in. We feel threatened, so we try to control the situation. This reactivity often strengthens unhealthy attachment patterns rather than allowing us to relate more skillfully. With mindfulness, we develop the capacity to notice, I'm feeling anxious about this relationship right now, without immediately acting from that anxiety. We can observe, I'm having thoughts about needing to fix this person's problem, without automatically jumping in to rescue. We can recognize, I'm experiencing fear that this person will leave, without engaging in clingy behavior motivated by that fear. This space between impulse and action is where our freedom lies, where we can choose a response aligned with our deeper values rather than our momentary attachments. The Buddha offered various meditation practices to develop mindfulness. One foundational approach involves focusing attention on the breath, noticing when the mind wanders, and gently returning attention to breathing sensations. This simple but challenging practice strengthens our ability to stay present rather than being carried away by thoughts about the past or future, which is where much of our attachment-driven thinking occurs. Another approach involves systematically bringing mindfulness to different aspects of experience, first to physical sensations, then to feelings, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, then to mental states, and finally to the content of thoughts themselves. This comprehensive practice, detailed in the Satipatthana Sutta, the discourse on the foundations of mindfulness, helps us recognize how attachment manifests across different dimensions of our experience. Through regular mindfulness practice, we begin to identify patterns in how attachment shows up in our lives. We might notice that certain situations consistently trigger controlling behavior, that specific words or tones from others activate our insecurity, or that particular physical sensations reliably precede reactive responses. This pattern recognition is invaluable because it allows us to catch attachment earlier in the process, before we're fully caught in its grip. Mindful awareness allows us to see our habitual patterns clearly, recognizing when we're loving with expectations or conditions. For instance, we might notice thoughts like, I'm only happy when this person responds in the way I want, or I need this relationship to work out, or I'll be devastated. We might observe how we subtly withdraw affection when someone doesn't meet our expectations or how we try to manage others' perceptions of us. These observations reveal the difference between genuine care and attachment disguised as love. This growing awareness can be uncomfortable at first. Many of us have blind spots around our attachment patterns, particularly if they've been normalized in our families or culture. We might have believed that constant texting, jealousy, or trying to change others were simply expressions of love rather than signs of attachment. Mindfulness brings these patterns into the light where we can examine them more objectively, which can initially feel threatening to our self-concept or relationship narratives. This is where the integration of mindfulness with self-compassion becomes essential. We need the clarity of mindfulness to see our patterns accurately, but we also need the kindness of self-compassion to work with what we discover without harsh judgment. Together, these qualities allow us to acknowledge our attachments without shame while also taking responsibility for how they affect our relationships. For example, someone might notice through mindfulness practice that they become controlling when they feel vulnerable. With this awareness, they can begin to recognize the early signs of this pattern, perhaps tension in their shoulders or thoughts about what others should be doing. Self-compassion allows them to acknowledge this tendency with understanding. This is a pattern I developed to feel safe, and it makes sense given my history. This compassionate clarity creates the conditions for change without self-punishment. One particularly helpful mindfulness practice for working with attachment involves deliberately bringing awareness to pleasant experiences while noticing any clinging that arises. When something enjoyable is happening, a loving exchange, physical affection, validation from someone important, we can practice maintaining present moment awareness while observing any tendency to grasp at the experience, wanting it to last longer or occur more frequently. This practice helps us distinguish between genuine appreciation and attachment-based clinging. Similarly, we can bring mindful awareness to unpleasant experiences related to attachment, the anxiety of waiting for a response, the sting of perceived rejection, the frustration when others don't meet our expectations. Rather than immediately reacting to these uncomfortable feelings, we can practice staying present with them, noticing their changing nature, and responding with greater wisdom rather than automatic reactivity. Regular mindfulness cultivates the present moment awareness needed to continually release attachment as it arises. This is a crucial point. Detaching with love isn't something we do once and complete, but rather an ongoing process of recognizing and releasing attachment as it appears in different contexts and relationships. Mindfulness gives us the tools to engage in this process continually rather than only addressing attachment when it becomes problematic enough to cause significant suffering. Implementing mindfulness in daily life involves both formal meditation practice and informal mindfulness during everyday activities. Formal practice might involve setting aside 10 to 30 minutes daily to systematically develop mindfulness through meditation. This builds the mental muscle of awareness that we can then apply in relationship contexts. Informal practice involves bringing mindful awareness to routine activities and interactions, noticing physical sensations during conversations, observing thoughts while texting someone important, or being aware of emotional reactions when plans with others change. Many people find it helpful to identify specific attachment triggers, situations that reliably activate attachment patterns, and make these particular focus areas for mindfulness practice. For someone whose attachment shows up strongly around communication, this might mean bringing special attention to their internal experience when sending messages, waiting for responses, or interpreting others' words. For someone whose attachment manifests around physical intimacy, it might involve mindfulness of sensations and thoughts during and after physical contact. The Buddha often emphasized the importance of persistent, consistent practice. He compared developing mindfulness to the gradual process of filling a water pot drop by drop. Each moment of awareness contributes to the overall development of this quality, even when progress isn't immediately apparent. This perspective encourages patience with the process rather than expecting immediate mastery or becoming discouraged when we fall back into attachment patterns. As mindfulness develops through regular practice, we often notice subtle shifts in our relationship to attachment. What previously felt like overwhelming urges that we had to act on begin to appear more clearly as temporary mental and physical events that we can observe with greater objectivity. Thoughts that once seemed absolutely true, "I need this person to validate me," or "I can't handle it if this relationship ends," start to be recognized as just thoughts, mental events that come and go rather than facts we must believe or act upon. This growing capacity to observe attachment without immediately identifying with it creates genuine freedom in relationships. We become less driven by unconscious patterns and more able to make conscious choices about how we relate to others. We can still feel the pull of attachment, the desire to control, the fear of loss, the craving for validation, but we're no longer completely at its mercy. We can notice these experiences, hold them with compassion, and choose responses aligned with our deeper values and intentions. This mindful awareness also helps us recognize the difference between healthy connection and attachment. Contrary to some misconceptions, Buddhist detachment doesn't mean avoiding all close relationships or caring about outcomes. Rather, it distinguishes between genuine connection, which involves presence, care, and engagement without grasping, and attachment-based relationships characterized by clinging, control, and conditional love. Mindfulness helps us feel the qualitative difference between these ways of relating, guiding us toward the former rather than the latter. The beauty of this approach is that it works gradually but dependably. Each moment of mindful awareness creates a small interruption in automatic attachment patterns. Over time, these small interruptions accumulate, weakening habitual reactions and creating new neural pathways associated with more spacious, less attached ways of relating. We don't need to force change through willpower alone. Rather, clear seeing naturally leads to transformation as we recognize which patterns create suffering and which lead to greater freedom and authentic connection. This transformation through mindfulness naturally guides us toward what the Buddha called the middle way, Majjhima Patipada. This concept lies at the very heart of Buddhist practice and offers profound guidance for finding balance in our relationships. The middle way isn't just a philosophical idea, it's a practical approach to navigating the complex territory between unhealthy attachment and disconnection. The Buddha discovered this balanced path through his own experience. Before his awakening, he had explored two extremes. First, the life of indulgence as a prince surrounded by pleasures, and then 6 years of extreme asceticism where he nearly starved himself to death in pursuit of spiritual insight. He found that neither extreme led to genuine liberation. Instead, he discovered a middle path that avoided both indulgence in sensual pleasure and harsh self-denial. This same principle applies directly to our relationships. On one extreme, we have unhealthy attachment or enmeshment, where boundaries blur, dependency flourishes, and we lose ourselves in others. On the opposite extreme lies disconnection or isolation, where we withdraw from meaningful contact, avoid vulnerability, and prioritize independence to the exclusion of connection. Neither extreme leads to genuine happiness or fulfillment. The middle way offers an alternative that honors both our need for connection and our need for autonomy. This balanced approach acknowledges our interdependence with others while respecting everyone's need for autonomy and space. As humans, we are inherently relational beings. We need connection, community, and meaningful relationships to thrive. Studies consistently show that social connection is one of the strongest predictors of well-being and even longevity. At the same time, we each have a fundamental need for autonomy, the freedom to make our own choices, develop our unique potentials, and maintain a distinct sense of self. The middle way honors both these truths rather than forcing us to choose between them. Practicing the middle way in relationships means being fully engaged without being controlling and being separate without being distant. Consider how this might look in a romantic partnership. The middle way involves deep emotional intimacy and commitment while still maintaining individual interests, friendships, and growth. Partners support each other without becoming responsible for each other's happiness. They share their lives while still having aspects that remain distinctly their own. They care deeply about each other's well-being without trying to control each other's choices or development. In parent-child relationships, the middle way shifts as children grow. With young children, it involves providing necessary guidance and protection while still respecting their emerging autonomy and unique personality. As children mature, it means remaining emotionally available while gradually releasing control, allowing natural consequences to teach lessons that parental lectures cannot. With adult children, it means maintaining loving connection while fully acknowledging their independence and right to make their own choices, even when those choices differ from what a parent might wish. In friendships, the middle way involves genuine care and mutual support without expectations of constant availability or perfect understanding. Friends practicing this balanced approach make time for each other while respecting busy periods when connection might be less frequent. They share important life events and emotions while not expecting friends to be their only source of support. They offer help during difficult times without taking over or assuming responsibility for fixing everything. It involves maintaining connection while allowing both ourselves and others the freedom to grow, change, and sometimes move in different directions. This acknowledgement of growth and change is crucial because many relationship difficulties arise from resistance to natural evolution. People grow at different rates and in different directions. Interests change, priorities shift. The middle way doesn't resist these natural developments, but rather accommodates them, allowing relationships to evolve rather than expecting them to remain static. This balanced perspective helps us navigate the natural ebb and flow of closeness in relationships without panic or grasping. All relationships have cycles, periods of greater and lesser connection, times of intense sharing, and times of more individual focus. Without a middle way understanding, these normal fluctuations can trigger anxiety and attempts to force closeness when natural space is needed, or withdrawal when reconnection is possible. The balanced approach helps us ride these waves with greater ease, trusting the underlying connection while allowing its expression to vary over time. Finding this balance isn't always easy. Most of us tend to lean toward one extreme or the other based on our temperament, attachment history, and cultural conditioning. Some people naturally prioritize connection, sometimes at the expense of healthy boundaries and personal needs. Others default toward independence, potentially missing opportunities for deeper intimacy and support. The middle way invites each of us to notice our habitual tendencies and gradually expand our capacity in the direction we typically avoid. For those who tend toward overconnection or codependency, practicing the middle way might involve developing greater comfort with solitude, learning to identify and express personal needs, and building direct relationships with their own emotions rather than always processing through others. It might mean practicing saying no when appropriate, developing interests independent of key relationships, or learning to self-soothe during periods of distress rather than immediately seeking external regulation. For those who lean toward isolation or excessive independence, the middle way might involve greater vulnerability, more transparent communication about emotions, or more frequent initiation of connection. It might mean noticing and working with the fear that often underlies avoidance of closeness, gradually building tolerance for the natural uncertainty that comes with deeper relationships, or developing greater flexibility when personal routines are disrupted by relational needs. The middle way teaches us to love from a place of wholeness rather than need, creating relationships that enhance rather than define our lives. When we approach relationships from the balanced perspective, we're not trying to extract something from others to feel complete or worthy. Rather, we're sharing our inherent wholeness with others who are also inherently whole, creating connections that enrich both lives without either person becoming dependent on the relationship for their basic sense of okayness. This doesn't mean we don't have needs or that healthy dependency has no place in relationships. The middle way acknowledges appropriate interdependence, the ways we naturally rely on each other for certain forms of support, connection, and growth. What it avoids is the unhealthy dependency that comes from believing we're fundamentally incomplete without specific others or specific forms of relationship. It's the difference between "I value our connection and the ways it enriches my life" and "I need this relationship to be okay as a person." Practical implementation of the middle way varies widely depending on individual circumstances, relationship dynamics, and cultural contexts. There's no single formula for the right balance between connection and independence. What looks balanced in one relationship might seem overly connected or distant in another. The key is developing awareness of where the healthy middle lies for you in each significant relationship, recognizing that this balance point may evolve over time as circumstances change. Some practical questions that can help identify the middle way in specific relationships include: Does this relationship support both people's growth and well-being, or mainly one person's at the expense of the other? Can both people express different perspectives and needs without threatening the connection? Is there room for both togetherness and separateness? Do both people maintain connections with others outside the relationship? Can conflicts be addressed directly, or does maintaining harmony require suppressing authentic expression? The Buddha offered specific practices to help develop the balanced approach of the middle way. Mindfulness meditation helps us observe our tendencies toward either grasping or aversion in relationships, creating awareness of when we're leaning too far toward either extreme. Loving kindness meditation cultivates the open-hearted care that supports healthy connection, while the inclusion of all beings in the practice prevents this care from becoming exclusive or possessive. Ethical guidelines provide boundaries that protect against harmful extremes while leaving plenty of room for individual expression within those boundaries. Cultivating the middle way in relationships takes time and patience. Most of us have deeply ingrained habits that pull us toward one extreme or the other, often established in early childhood and reinforced throughout our lives. Change happens gradually as we bring mindful awareness to these patterns and consistently choose responses that move us toward greater balance. Each small choice, to reach out when we typically withdraw, to create space when we typically cling, to express a need when we typically self-sacrifice, contributes to establishing new, more balanced relationship patterns. It's also helpful to remember that perfect balance isn't the goal. The middle way is more about continuous adjustment than achieving some ideal static equilibrium. Just as a tightrope walker makes constant small adjustments to maintain balance, we continuously calibrate our approach to relationships based on changing circumstances, feedback from others, and growing self-awareness. There will be times when we lean more toward connection, and times when we emphasize independence, with the overall pattern reflecting a balanced approach rather than every moment being perfectly centered. One of the most beautiful aspects of the middle way is how it aligns with the reality of our human experience. We are neither completely separate individuals nor merely extensions of our relationships. We exist in an interdependent web of connection while maintaining our unique consciousness and agency. The middle way honors this complex reality rather than forcing us into oversimplified extremes. It acknowledges that we can be both connected and distinct, both loving and boundaried, both engaged and free. This balanced perspective applies not just to our relationships with others, but also to our relationship with ourselves. The middle way helps us balance self-care with care for others, self-acceptance with growth-oriented change, and self-responsibility with appropriate requests for support. It guides us away from both self-indulgence and harsh self-criticism toward a compassionate, realistic relationship with ourselves that serves as the foundation for healthy relationships with others. Cultural factors significantly influence how the middle way manifests in relationships. Different cultures place varying emphasis on collectivism versus individualism, explicit versus implicit communication, and direct versus hierarchical relationship structures. The balanced approach doesn't impose a one-size-fits-all model, but rather invites each person to find the middle path that honors both their cultural context and their individual needs. What looks like healthy balance will vary across cultures while still embodying the core principle of avoiding harmful extremes. As we practice the middle way in relationships, we often notice positive shifts in both our connection with others and our sense of personal well-being. Relationships become less fraught with drama and power struggles as we release the need to control outcomes or extract validation. We experience greater authenticity as we no longer feel compelled to suppress parts of ourselves to maintain connection. Others often respond positively to this balanced approach as well, appreciating the combination of genuine care and respect for autonomy that it embodies. The balanced perspective of the middle way ultimately transforms how we experience love itself. Rather than seeing love as something that creates dependency or threatens independence, we discover that the most fulfilling love actually enhances freedom, both our own and others. We find that we can care deeply while holding lightly, that we can commit fully while allowing space for growth and change, that we can be profoundly connected while remaining distinct. This integrated understanding of love as both connected and spacious provides the foundation for relationships that heal rather than harm, that liberate rather than constrain, and that bring genuine joy rather than the temporary relief of having attachment needs met. This integrated understanding of balanced relationships naturally leads us to examine one of the most challenging aspects of detaching with love: the complex relationship between expectations and hopes. How do we navigate the territory between having no expectations at all, which might seem like giving up, and holding rigid expectations that inevitably lead to disappointment? Buddhist wisdom offers particularly nuanced guidance on this question, distinguishing between wholesome aspirations and rigid expectations that cause suffering when reality differs from our plans. Expectations are essentially demands we place on reality, beliefs about how things should unfold, how people should behave, or what outcomes should result from our actions. They're often unconscious and automatic, shaped by our past experiences, cultural conditioning, and personal preferences. The problem isn't having preferences or desires, but rather the rigid attachment to specific outcomes that creates suffering when reality inevitably takes its own course. The Buddha identified this pattern as a primary source of suffering. When we expect relationships to follow a certain path and they don't, we experience disappointment, frustration, or anger. We might think, "My partner should understand my needs without me having to explain," or "My friend should respond to my message right away," or "This relationship should make me feel consistently happy." When reality doesn't match these internal demands, we often blame ourselves, blame others, or try to force situations to conform to our expectations. Detaching from expectations means accepting what is actually happening rather than fighting against reality or trying to force outcomes. This doesn't mean becoming passive or apathetic. Instead, it means engaging with the world as it is rather than as we insist it should be. This shift allows us to respond to actual circumstances with wisdom and creativity rather than reacting from disappointment when our expectations aren't met. For example, you might have an expectation that a significant conversation with someone will go a certain way. They'll listen receptively, understand your perspective, and respond as you hope. With this rigid expectation in place, anything different feels like failure. If they become defensive or misunderstand your point, you might become frustrated or give up entirely. When you detach from this specific expectation while maintaining your intention to communicate clearly, you remain flexible enough to adapt to what's actually happening. You might try a different approach, suggest continuing the conversation later, or simply listen more deeply to understand their perspective first. This practice involves recognizing the difference between setting intentions, which guide our actions, and attachment to specific results beyond our control. Intentions focus on what we bring to a situation, our attitude, effort, and approach. They're within our control and help direct our energy in positive ways. Expectations, on the other hand, focus on specific outcomes that depend on many factors beyond our control, including other people's choices, timing, and circumstances. In relationships, this distinction is crucial. We can set an intention to communicate openly, to offer support, or to create healthy boundaries. These intentions guide our behavior and are within our control. However, we can't control how others will respond to our communication, whether they'll accept our support, or how they'll react to our boundaries. When we confuse intentions with expectations, believing that our good intentions should guarantee specific outcomes, we set ourselves up for disappointment and often blame others when results don't match our expectations. The Buddha taught this distinction through many stories and teachings. In one discourse, he compares the mind attached to expectations to a wild deer caught in a hunter's snare, struggling and causing itself more suffering through its resistance. the deer who accepts its current reality, even while intending to eventually find freedom, remains calm enough to eventually find an opportunity to escape. This parable illustrates how accepting reality as it is, rather than struggling against it, actually creates more space for positive change. Letting go of expectations doesn't mean abandoning hope or positive intention. This is a common misunderstanding that prevents many people from exploring this practice. They fear that without expectations, they'll become complacent or unmotivated. Buddhist psychology offers a more nuanced understanding. We can maintain hope, positive intention, and even clear goals without the rigid attachment to specific outcomes that create suffering. Hope in this context isn't blind optimism or wishful thinking, but rather an open-hearted orientation toward possibility. It acknowledges that positive change is possible without demanding exactly how or when it must occur. This kind of hope remains flexible and resilient in the face of setbacks because it's not attached to particular timelines or specific manifestations. It can adapt and find new pathways forward when initial approaches don't yield expected results. For instance, you might hope for reconciliation with someone after a conflict. Without expectations, this hope guides constructive actions like openness to conversation and willingness to understand their perspective. However, you remain flexible about exactly how and when reconciliation might occur, recognizing that the process may unfold differently than you initially envisioned. This flexibility prevents the disappointment and resentment that arise when rigid expectations aren't met. The Buddha taught that peace comes not from having what we want, but from wanting what we have in each moment. This teaching directly addresses our tendency to place happiness in the future, contingent on specific conditions being met. We think, I'll be happy when this relationship improves, or I'll feel peace when this person changes their behavior. This conditional approach to happiness guarantees dissatisfaction with the present moment and creates the suffering of constantly striving for something other than what is. Releasing expectations while maintaining positive intention creates space for unexpected growth and healing. When we're not fixated on specific outcomes, we can notice opportunities and possibilities that might otherwise escape our attention. We become more responsive to what's actually emerging rather than trying to force situations into our preconceived ideas about how things should unfold. Consider someone hoping for deeper connection in a relationship. With rigid expectations, they might have a specific vision of what this should look like, perhaps daily deep conversations, particular expressions of affection, or certain shared activities. When reality doesn't match this vision, they feel disappointed and may even give up on the relationship. Without these rigid expectations, they remain open to how connection might naturally develop, which could take forms they hadn't anticipated. Perhaps connection deepens through navigating a challenge together, through brief but consistent checking in, or through some shared interest that emerges unexpectedly. Practically speaking, how do we work with expectations in our relationships? The first step is becoming aware of our often unconscious expectations. Mindfulness practice helps us notice when we're operating from rigid demands about how things should be. Often these expectations reveal themselves through our emotional reactions. Disappointment, frustration, or resentment typically signal an unmet expectation. Rather than immediately acting on these emotions, we can use them as information to identify the underlying expectation. Once we've identified an expectation, we can examine it more closely. Is it realistic given the circumstances? Is it something we can control, or does it depend on factors beyond our influence? Is it flexible enough to accommodate the complexity of human relationships? This examination helps us distinguish between reasonable preferences and rigid demands that cause suffering. We might still prefer that a friend responds promptly to messages, but we can release the rigid expectation that they must always do so to be a good friend. Another helpful practice involves deliberately cultivating gratitude for what is rather than focusing on what should be. When we notice ourselves caught in expectations, we can gently redirect attention to appreciating aspects of the relationship or situation that are working well. This doesn't mean ignoring genuine problems or accepting harmful behavior, but rather balancing our awareness of challenges with recognition of what's positive and present. The Buddha recommended a practice called mudita, or appreciative joy, as an antidote to expectation-driven dissatisfaction. This involves taking genuine pleasure in positive aspects of our lives and relationships as they currently exist, rather than focusing on what's lacking or what could be better. Regular cultivation of appreciative joy helps shift our attention from what we don't have to what we do have, gradually reducing the suffering caused by unmet expectations. It's also helpful to distinguish between expectations regarding outcomes and expectations regarding our own approach. While we can release attachment to specific outcomes, we can maintain clear expectations for our own behavior, how we'll communicate, the values we'll uphold, the effort we'll bring. These self-directed expectations provide guidance without creating the suffering that comes from trying to control external circumstances or other people's choices. When working with particularly entrenched expectations, some find it helpful to practice what Buddhist teacher Tara Brach calls radical acceptance. Fully acknowledging the reality of what is happening right now, even when it differs significantly from what we expected or hoped for. This doesn't mean resigning ourselves to harmful situations or giving up on positive change, but rather starting from an honest recognition of current reality rather than struggling against it. From this ground of acceptance, we can then take wise action toward improvement. In relationships, letting go of expectations often unfolds gradually rather than all at once. We might begin with smaller, less emotionally charged expectations before working with core expectations about love, commitment, or connection. For example, we might practice releasing expectations about how a casual friendship should develop before addressing expectations in our closest relationships. This gradual approach builds the emotional muscle of flexibility and acceptance that we can then apply in more challenging contexts. It's important to acknowledge that releasing expectations doesn't mean having no standards or boundaries in relationships. We can release rigid expectations about how others should behave while still maintaining clear boundaries about what behavior we will and won't accept in our lives. The difference is that boundaries focus on our own choices and limits rather than demanding specific behavior from others. Instead of expecting, "You must always respond to my texts within an hour," an expectation, we might decide, "I choose not to continue investing in relationships where there's consistently no response to my attempts at communication," a boundary. The Buddhist perspective on expectations invites us to hold our hopes, plans, and visions lightly, appreciating their guidance while not becoming fixated on specific manifestations. This lightness creates space for the natural unfolding of relationships, allowing for surprises, growth in unexpected directions, and adaptations to changing circumstances. Rather than seeing deviations from our expectations as failures, we can view them as invitations to expand our understanding and discover new possibilities. This approach transforms how we experience disappointment when things don't go as planned. Instead of being overwhelmed by feelings of failure or rejection, we can meet disappointment with curiosity. What can I learn from this? What possibilities does this open that I hadn't considered? How might this apparent setback actually serve growth or healing in ways I can't currently see? This curious, open stance toward disappointment transforms it from something to be avoided at all costs to a natural part of life that can yield unexpected insights and opportunities. By releasing expectations while maintaining hope and intention, we create relationships characterized by greater flexibility, resilience, and joy in the present moment. We reduce unnecessary suffering caused by fighting against reality. We open ourselves to possibilities beyond what we could have planned or expected, and we discover that meaningful connection and growth can unfold in ways far richer and more surprising than our limited expectations could have imagined. This openness to possibilities brings us to the final crucial aspect of detaching with love, actually implementing these Buddhist principles in our everyday lives and relationships. all the understanding in the world doesn't help much if it remains theoretical. The Buddha emphasized that these teachings should be lived rather than merely understood intellectually. He compared theoretical knowledge without practice to a person who counts others' money without having any wealth themselves. So how do we bring these principles into our daily challenges, conflicts, and disappointments? Bringing Buddhist detachment principles into everyday interactions transforms these difficulties into opportunities for practice. Each challenging conversation, emotional trigger, or relationship disappointment becomes not just a problem to solve, but a chance to notice attachment arising and to choose a more spacious, compassionate response. Rather than seeing these moments as interruptions to our spiritual practice, we recognize them as the very substance of the practice itself. Consider a common scenario. You send an important message to someone and hours pass without a response. You notice anxiety building, your mind creating stories about what their silence means, perhaps feelings of rejection or resentment arising. This ordinary moment contains all the elements needed for practice: attachment to a specific outcome, a prompt response, expectations about how others should behave, and the emotional reactions that signal these attachments. Instead of being carried away by these reactions, you can use this situation as an opportunity to practice. You might take a mindful pause, noticing the physical sensations of anxiety and the thoughts racing through your mind. You could acknowledge your expectations while gently loosening their grip. I'm noticing I expected an immediate response and I'm creating stories about what this delay means. I don't actually know why they haven't responded yet. You might offer yourself some self-compassion for the discomfort you're feeling, and perhaps extend loving kindness to the other person who may be dealing with circumstances you're unaware of. This kind of everyday practice doesn't require special conditions or extensive time. It happens in the midst of regular life, during work interactions, family dynamics, casual conversations, and social media exchanges. Any moment where you notice attachment, expectation, or the desire to control outcomes becomes an invitation to practice releasing these patterns while maintaining care and presence. Daily application might include taking mindful pauses when feeling reactive, using simple phrases of loving kindness during difficult conversations, or reflecting on impermanence when facing loss. These micro-practices, applied consistently in everyday situations, gradually reshape our habitual responses to relationship challenges. Rather than immediately reacting from attachment, we develop the capacity to pause, notice what's happening internally, and choose a more spacious response. For example, during a disagreement with someone important, you might notice tension building in your body and an urgent need to defend your position or convince the other person you're right. These sensations and impulses signal attachment, in this case, attachment to being understood or validated in a particular way. Rather than being carried away by these reactions, you could take a deep breath, silently acknowledge, "This matters to me, and I'm feeling attached to a specific outcome," and perhaps offer a silent wish for both yourself and the other person. May we both find understanding here. May this conversation serve our connection rather than dividing us. This pause doesn't guarantee the conversation will go as you hope, but it creates space for a different kind of engagement, one not driven primarily by attachment to winning or being right. Even a moment of mindful awareness in the midst of conflict can shift the quality of the interaction and prevent escalation driven by attachment reactions. Similarly, you might practice with impermanence during everyday transitions and endings. When a project ends at work, a friendship naturally grows distant due to changing circumstances, or a phase of family life concludes as children grow. These moments offer opportunities to notice any resistance or clinging. Rather than fighting against these natural changes, you can acknowledge the bittersweetness of transition while allowing things to evolve as they will. This doesn't mean suppressing genuine sadness about endings, but rather holding that sadness with awareness of the broader context of ongoing change. Regular reflection on how attachment manifests in our specific relationships helps personalize these principles and make them practical. Each of us has unique attachment patterns shaped by our history, personality, and current circumstances. Some of us become most attached in romantic relationships while maintaining easy detachment in friendships. Others might find family relationships trigger the strongest attachment reactions, while work relationships remain relatively straightforward. Some people attach primarily to being liked or approved of, while others attach more to being in control or being right. Understanding your specific attachment patterns allows you to bring focused attention to the areas where you most need practice. You might ask yourself, in which relationships do I most often feel anxious, controlling, or resentful when things don't go as I expect? What situations reliably trigger my attachment responses? What early warning signs in my body or thoughts indicate that I'm becoming attached to a specific outcome? This personalized awareness helps you catch attachment earlier in the process, before it fully takes over your reactions. It's also helpful to identify specific phrases or reminders that resonate with you personally. Some people find it helpful to silently repeat, "This too shall pass," when caught in difficult emotions. Others connect more with phrases like, "Let it be," or "Not my circus, not my monkeys," when tempted to control situations beyond their responsibility. Still others find questions more effective. Is this mine to manage? Or what would love do here? These personalized reminders, used in challenging moments, help interrupt automatic attachment responses and create space for more conscious choices. Technology presents both particular challenges and opportunities for practicing detachment. Digital communication often amplifies attachment tendencies through immediate feedback or lack thereof, visible indicators of others' responses, read receipts, typing indicators, and the illusion of constant connection. Many people find their strongest attachment reactions triggered by social media interactions, text message exchanges, or email communications. These contexts provide abundant opportunities to notice attachment arising and practice releasing it. You might establish specific practices for technology use that support healthy detachment. This could include deciding not to check responses to important messages while in the middle of other activities, setting boundaries around device-free times, or developing rituals that help maintain perspective when using social media. Even something as simple as taking 3 conscious breaths before checking notifications can create space for mindful awareness rather than reactive attachment. The Buddha emphasized that these teachings should be adjusted to fit individual circumstances and needs. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to implementing detachment principles. Someone dealing with grief after losing a loved one will practice differently than someone navigating a difficult workplace relationship. A parent practicing detachment with an adult child struggling with addiction will implement these principles differently than someone practicing in a romantic relationship. The core principles remain consistent, but their application flexes to meet different situations with wisdom and compassion. It's also important to acknowledge that progress in detaching with love typically happens gradually, with occasional setbacks and periods of stronger attachment. The Buddha compared spiritual development to the gradual wearing away of an axe handle through repeated use. Change happens through consistent practice over time rather than through dramatic overnight transformation. This perspective encourages patience with ourselves and others as we work with deeply ingrained attachment patterns. When you notice yourself caught in strong attachment despite your best intentions, perhaps becoming controlling in an important relationship or experiencing intense anxiety when plans change, treat this as valuable information rather than as failure. These moments highlight areas where attachment runs especially deep, often connected to core fears or unmet needs. Rather than judging yourself harshly, you can bring curiosity and compassion to these experiences. I'm noticing how strongly I'm reacting right now. What might this intensity be telling me about what matters to me or what I'm afraid of losing? Regular reflection on how attachment manifests in our specific relationships helps personalize these principles and make them practical. You might set aside time weekly to to journal about patterns you've noticed, situations where you practice successfully, and areas where you still feel consistently challenged. This reflection helps identify both progress and opportunities for continued growth, making abstract principles increasingly concrete and personal. Many practitioners find it helpful to connect with others who are working with similar principles. This might involve formal settings like meditation groups or Dharma study, or more informal arrangements like conversations with friends who share an interest in developing healthier attachment patterns. These connections provide encouragement, perspective, and often helpful insights about blind spots or alternative approaches we might not see on our own. As these practices become integrated into daily life, detaching with love gradually becomes our natural response rather than a concept we struggle to apply. What initially requires conscious effort, pausing before reacting, offering loving kindness during conflict, accepting impermanence, slowly becomes more automatic. We find ourselves spontaneously responding with greater spaciousness and compassion in situations that previously triggered strong attachment reactions. This integration doesn't mean we never experience attachment or that we achieve some perfect state of detachment. Rather, we develop greater awareness of attachment when it arises and more skill in working with it compassionately. We recover more quickly from attachment-driven reactions. We notice subtle forms of attachment that previously operated outside our awareness, and we experience more frequent moments of genuine presence and connection, unclouded by the need to control or possess. The transformation that results from consistently practicing these principles affects not just our significant relationships, but our entire orientation toward life. We find ourselves less thrown by unexpected changes, less driven by the need for specific outcomes, and more able to appreciate what each moment offers without grasping to make it last or pushing it away because it doesn't match our expectations. This shift brings a quality of ease and openness to our experience, even amid life's inevitable challenges. This doesn't mean detaching with love makes life perfectly smooth or free from pain. The Buddha never promised that practice would eliminate all difficulties, only that it would transform our relationship to those difficulties. We still experience disappointment when hopes aren't realized, sadness when relationships end, and concern when loved ones struggle. The difference lies in how we hold these experiences, with spacious awareness rather than contracted resistance, with compassion for ourselves and others rather than blame or resentment. Through consistent practice in everyday situations, we gradually discover that detaching with love isn't something we do just during specific challenges or formal meditation. It becomes a way of being in the world, an approach to all our experiences characterized by presence, compassion, and a willingness to engage fully without clinging. We find that we can indeed care deeply, love wholeheartedly, and remain fully engaged with life while holding all of it with a lighter, more open hand. And in this balance of wholehearted engagement without attachment, we discover a freedom and peace that doesn't depend on everything going according to plan, but rather arises from meeting life as it actually is, moment by precious moment.